Welcome to Studies in Torah. This is our follow-up podcast from our sessions on Monday nights. I'm David Gordon. I'm here with David Rickman, and we want to help address some things that we didn't either we didn't get to on Monday evenings, or things that we feel like need to be more greatly addressed. So one of the questions you guys may remember, and some of you laughed, Monday night I was addressed by my wife many times over the years, why does it matter? And so things like the cosmic waters, or, if there are other gods. And so when you get some of these big biblical or kind of theological things, it becomes, as you know, studying the scriptures. Sometimes it can kind of stay out there in motherland, or it can stay out there in a way that we don't move it to a practical. And so it's really important that we understand the field of play. David and I were just sitting here talking. And for instance, I grew up playing sports. Many of you probably did. You don't want to be a basketball player trying to play on a football field. You don't want to be, you're a tennis ace, and you are being addressed to play soccer. So we want to have the right players and the right field in mind. And so one of the ways to understand this is that if you were to break down the scriptures into just like we would call it the big three concerning biblical worldview. You would have in the origins, in the beginning, as we discussed Monday night, cosmology, which is the origin, the nature, and the structure of the heavens and the earth. And we just know that if we can work through Genesis 1, 2, working through up through Genesis 11 and get this right origin of the story, it will then rightly set in context the next piece, which is soteriology. We know these are big terms, but soteriology basically is the salvation and the redemption of mankind. And how does God begin the soteriology piece? As we pick it up like in Genesis 12 with the Jewish narrative, right? And if we don't have cosmology and the origins correct, then our soteriology will be amok, right? It will at some point break down. Like, for instance, if you are off an inch on your foundation when you're building a house, or you're off an inch on a wall or a ceiling, at some point as you move toward the finishing of the project, it's going to just, the house is going to break down. It's not going to be right. It would be like having a crack in the foundation. And so cosmology, origins, soteriology, the redemption and the salvation of mankind unto its, quote, its eschatological end, eschatology, which is the study of the time of the end. Our soteriology and our eschatology will be just way off, and we'll miss the picture that and the story that God is telling if our cosmology is off-centered. This is why David and I are addressing this class, and we feel like it's really crucial to get these origin pieces into their right place, so then that we can rightly interpret soteriology and eschatology going forward. So, Dave, coming out of Genesis 1, we were just discussing some things that we think are important to continue to follow up with related to the heavens and the earth. And so, man, I just want to pitch it your way as we look at, you began to address this issue of chaos to order. And, man, what's going on there? Any background from you, anything I've just said? But as we move forward to looking afresh at Genesis 1, the heavens and the earth, give us some background to this chaos to order idea.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important for us to understand that Genesis is is within a context. The book is set uh, within a context in a world and a culture, and so we'll reference it, and you'll see it referenced of the ancient Near East, and so it's really important to understand that it's not just a clinical treatment of origins that's totally disconnected from the culture that it's set within. And so throughout Genesis, especially throughout these initial chapters, there are ways that Genesis is referencing things that existed even in other ancient Near Eastern stories that existed about the beginnings, and they had their own narratives about how things came about with creation and with beginnings of humanity and the gods and all of these things. But Genesis has its own take, and actually it has its own uh, even like subtle and but real criticisms of some of those ideas in the text, and a lot of that is really good for us to know that that's going on, to see the uniqueness of the story of the God of Israel and what he's setting forth in these beginning chapters. And so, obviously, in the beginning, I mean, David went through this. We worked through this the other night. That really you have the beginning of the earth being formless and void, darkness, and this wasteland emptiness, and of chaos and the waters. And what happens with this is God begins to bring order to this. God begins to speak, and he begins to create and bring order to chaos and darkness. And through these narratives of what's going on with creation, there are references to these, like I mentioned earlier, subtle references to context in the ancient Near East, and we're not going to really go into those in this session, but just for example, we'll do a few of them here. And I think it's important to point out things like when God makes the lights in the expanse of the heavens.
What verse are you in, David?
I'm in verse 14. So when he makes the lights in the expanse, and he says in 16, he says, God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. And so it's kind of interesting because like he even uses the language of great lights versus using just sun and moon. I mean, like, why not just say, the equivalent of that, because that was there. But actually, there were in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the sun and the moon were astral like deities that were worshipped, and the fact that even using the language here is helpful to see the counterculture view of Genesis. But also, what you see is that Yahweh made it, and if as creator, if he makes something, then that means that something is not on his level. He's unique in his power and in his by virtue of being the one who made all things. And so I know this is something that we know, but the way that Genesis tells the story would really cause ancient Near Eastern readers or hearers of the story for their ears to kind of perk up and say, "Whoa!" Like, my narrative about this thing would be totally different, And another example would be like in verse 21, on the day when God he makes every living creature that moves, but before he says that, he says God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves. And so it's like, why not just why take the time to talk about sea monsters as a classification among all these other creatures. Like, why do you even bring that up? It's like, and God made, it's like saying like, and God made the lion and the lemur, or something among all these other animals. And the reason why he highlights this thing is because the great sea monsters were a big element within like pagan mythology of the ancient Near East, that there were these ancient great monsters. And we even see this come up in the Hebrew scriptures, other places. And we're not going to get into that, but like we see that these creatures were seen as like divine or being involved in the creation themselves. And the fact that Yahweh created them, it strips them of their unique power. It's that Yahweh is unique as the creator over everything. And so we just see that over and over in the creation narrative of his uniqueness.
So not only God's connected to the lights in the sky, as we know, lesser, greater light, sun and moon, but also God's coming out of the sea in the earth. Yeah. These were all commonly understood in the ancient Near East as gods and their connection to the creation, right? And their worship, literally, those individuals, in the pagans are worshiping the gods. Okay, so I think about that, and what does that look like when an individual faces, maybe for the first time, oh my goodness, Yahweh trumps my God. What does that look like? Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, so good.
So David, just any other thing in connection to that, what I just said, what happens with this term, the uniqueness of Yahweh in regards to the other gods, in regards to maybe even creation? Anything else you want to say about this piece related to his uniqueness?
Yeah, I think that we could talk about this uniqueness even with moving into what we looked at with the pronouncements, when you have these kind of strange pronouncements, especially with the creation of man, right off the get-go of, let us make man in our image. And it's like, well, who's the us, and what's going on there? And we talked about the other night, David brought up the framework of that there are these other divine beings, these other entities that Yahweh made, but he is addressing them in these instances. But what's important to remember related to uniqueness, we could talk some more about these entities, but what's really important about the uniqueness is that there is the pronouncement of, let us do this thing. He'll speak it to a group, but then what happens, the action that follows, is always done by Yahweh. Singular. Mm-hmm. And so he'll say, let us do this, and then he creates, or let us do this, and he drives them out of the garden, and these other references. And so it's very clear that who's in charge and who has the power and who is actually presiding uniquely over these other entities. There's no confusion about that, of what's going on. And that is very in contrast to, again, even these other ancient Near Eastern narratives where the gods are jockeying for positions and power, and there's multiple gods doing this and whatever. And so it really lays out the biblical framework of Yahweh as supreme over all.
I love that, David. I want to read this passage that we did not get to the other night from Psalm 89, but it explains exactly what David just mentioned. Psalm 89, verses 5 through 8. And the heavens will praise your wonders, O Yahweh, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the holy ones. This is the assembly of the divine council of other gods. Verse 6, for who in the skies is comparable to Yahweh? Who among the sons of the mighty is like Yahweh. That Yahweh has divine sons called the sons of God. And we're going to pick this up in future sessions. Verse 7, a God greatly feared in the council of the holy ones. So it's very clear here that Yahweh is the one greatly feared in the midst of the council of other created divine beings. I love this part as well in verse 7. And awesome above all those who are around him. O Yahweh Elohim, O Lord God of hosts, who is like you, Almighty Lord, Almighty Yahweh, your faithfulness also surrounds you. I think it's a great passage to just highlight what David was just speaking of. Yeah.
So good. So good.
So David, going back to Genesis 1:26 to 28, I think it's good. You began to allude to this, but we have God. It says, then God, Elohim, it's always plural in the Hebrew Bible, but God, Elohim said, let us make man in our image. And then it turns and it's singular, but Elohim created, singular. He created the heavens and the earth. Dave, if you could talk just a little more around this maybe this us, plural and singular thing, and what's going on here in term, because we're going to see this term us show up several other times. It's going to show up in Genesis 3:22. It's going to show up in Genesis 11:7, and I know we're going to deal with this in the future, but I think it's good, again, we get this understanding out of Genesis 1, so then we can rightly interpret 3:22, 11:7. Anything you want to speak to related to that will help us understand. Again, Genesis 1:26 is not what we would say a Trinitarian concept. It's not the Trinity there. It's God, Elohim. It's Yahweh Elohim. He is making this declaration in the midst of his divine counsel, the us. Okay, and what does that, give a little more background here if you can, and what does that mean in relation to man?
Yeah, I think that as we look at this pronouncement in his counsel, I think that it's reflective of what the design of man is and their role and function. And so similarly to those in the council that he's speaking to, these sons of God that exist, that are gathered and to hear the pronouncement, they've been given authority, like what you kind of laid out, David, on Monday, is that these other entities were actually given authority, and they're given their own stewardship, but
in their own domain as well,
exactly.
Right? Okay,
it's within their own setting, which is really the heavens and how that works itself out. They have their area, so to speak, and then man is given his area of stewardship and really rule, and that's
in the earth.
Yeah, in the earth. And so this is kind of the two regions of between man is given the earth and these sons of God are given the heavens, and they're both going to be held accountable for their stewardship over those regions. And so I think that we could talk a little bit more about the image and things like this in just a few minutes, but I think that kind of sets the stage for what's going on in the address to this council of what Yahweh is doing to address them.
So, David, I don't know if we want to move over into this. It may be a good place when just to address this. I think it's really important because when you first come into the knowledge that there are other gods, mm-hmm. It's confrontive. because we've always been taught what we know as monotheism, a term that was actually derived from or developed in the 17th century. And so, like when we read passages, and I'm just going to read these two verses, David, and then just ask you to comment on them out of Deuteronomy 4, verse 35. To you it was shown, and of course this is Israel. To you, Israel, it was shown that you might know that Yahweh, He is Elohim. There is no other besides Him. Verse 39, again, Deuteronomy 4, 35, and then verse 39. Know therefore today, take it to heart, that Yahweh, He is Elohim, in heaven above and on earth below, there is no other. So, David, obviously individuals would read passages like that, and they would begin to read this monotheistic understanding into those passages. Might really be good to maybe just briefly share ancient understanding of monotheism biblically versus maybe how it derived into the 17th century with a whole nother framework. It might just be good for you just to walk through that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important to see that, for ancient cultures, all gods existed, and that was just, all gods exist.
It's common. It was just, this is the way it is.
Yeah,
it's true. Yeah,
yeah, and I think that it's hard for us to really understand that kind of worldview because we're living in this like post-enlightenment, postmodernism kind of thing of really the divine has kind of been removed from our framework. Excellent. And so we have this like totally kind of naturalistic world that doesn't have a, this divine thing. Those have kind of in society kind of been deleted out of the thing through so much history, and the shifts of worldviews. But for the ancients, it's like all gods existed. And with this framework, I think it's important for us to really like step back and think about, and you brought this up, David, the other night, is like, think about the commandments that God gives Israel through the scriptures and just the constant admonitions for them to worship Him versus
exclusively.
Yeah, versus these other gods. But it's like that doesn't even make any sense if those beings don't really exist. It's like you shall have no other non-entities before me. It's like, what does that even mean? And so we have to understand that God's not just calling Israel to some higher degree of intellectual knowledge to understand that there is no other existences. You know what I mean? Yes. It really is these other beings, He made them, but these other beings are actually attached to the nations of the earth. And we're going to look at how that happens later on in the class.
Yes.
That they're actually attached to and given authority related to other nations of the earth, but Yahweh is the God of Israel, and why that carries forward and why exclusive worship is demanded of them. It's explicitly in this. And so but I think that this verse, I think we can look at this one example, and this is kind of a bigger subject than what we could cover in this, and we'll talk more about it in the class, but we have to understand sometimes the language of some of these things is not meant to deny the existence of these other beings, but to emphasize exclusive worship. And emphasize exclusive devotion to the God of Israel. And so these passages like the one you read in Deuteronomy 4, but also like in Isaiah, through the string of Isaiah, when he's like condemning the idolatry and all of this stuff, you'll get stuff like, I'm the Lord, there is no other,
Yes.
Besides me, there is no God. And these references, these references are expressions of superiority. They are used as kind of like it's kind of a silly way to say it, but it's almost like a divine trash talk, of like putting down these other entities, in to try to advance like Israel worshiping him exclusively. And so these phrases are used in other contexts, and we see them as just being expressions of superiority. Like, for instance, one of them is in Isaiah 47, verse 8. Babylon is talking about Babylon, and it says that they were saying to themselves, you're saying to yourself, I am, and there's none besides me. Now, it's like virtually the same type of phrasing of it. And nobody's saying that, Babylon is the only political empire or nation in the day. And so it's a superiority kind of thing. Or another one is in Zephaniah 2:15 about Nineveh, who says to herself, I am, and there's none besides me. And so this is language that is expressing that. And so it's not denying the existence of these other beings. And so we have to understand that monotheism is, for the ancients, was like, I guess we have to look at it as like monotheism as being qualified by, for the ancients, it didn't deny the existence of these other beings, but later monotheism kind of became known as that. And we really have that definition from the 17th century that we're trying to apply to ancient peoples. And that's really hard to do. It's hard to take that and impose that upon the ancient peoples as the parameters for looking at what's going on. So, that's just a few thoughts to address that. And there's so much more we could talk about with idols and idolatry and these gods and how the nations worship them. And I think we'll kind of, develop that more as we talk about things in the class.
Yes. Isn't it interesting? Yahweh, after 430 years, he delivers Israel, from Egypt in the bondage. And then he calls them out of the gods of Egypt to himself. And you shall have no other gods before me, for I am the Lord, your Yahweh. That kind of thing. And again, we see this all through the Torah. It just really helps us to understand. Again, David, if we don't have this background of the other gods, the other Elohim, I mean, when you're just reading passages like the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, it just, like you said, it just makes no sense, So I appreciate you giving some background to some backdrop to this monotheism idea, because it's helpful that they were not denying other gods. It was an issue of exclusive worship of Yahweh, and this is what was going on. And so, anyway, David, so moving on, I don't know if you have anything else about that. I know we got more that we can share or put out. David has a couple other really good articles. If any of you have interest in this whole idea of monotheism, and maybe even how it progressed over the centuries, there's some good background to understand what's going on. But I think the essence of what we just said is really helpful to understand. So, David, continuing on with this, this Genesis 1:26-27, man being made in the image of, not just that Yahweh said to his council, let us make man in our image. Let's now move on to that being an imager of God. What does it mean that man is actually made in the image and / in the likeness of Yahweh, or in the image and the likeness of the gods? What does that look like from both a divine? Is there something like being replicated in men as a function, the way it's happening even on a divine level?
Yeah. I think that it's for us to see this, first of all, is that image and likeness. I think that they're it's not necessarily two things. I think that it's kind of wrapped up together.
Okay.
So I don't think that there's, I mean, some people may try to really parse those out, but I think that it connects as just two ways of saying one thing. But yeah, it is interesting because it doesn't actually take in the passage here, we don't even actually have the whole, like, let me explain to you what this image, that whole thing. And really, I think that the context, we have to look at the context for what's going on to be able
to define that.
Yeah, I think that's the best way forward
good.
with it, because a lot of times people approach this and then you just start asking questions. Okay, like, what does it mean? What's unique about man versus other creation? And then we kind of develop all these different, like, somewhat philosophical answers to that, or we talk about how is man, what comprises man and man's, spirit, soul, and body, or what, all these different kind of things. But that's not really like in the context here. I think that the framework of it is, let us make man in our image according to our likeness and let them rule. Right after that, he just says, and let them rule over all of this creation, these things in the creation. God made man in his own image, in the image of God he created him, male and female, and then he blesses them, calls them to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over. And so I think that the real context of it is the function of man is to be God's representatives in the earth of his rule and stewardship. And so they're giving this stewardship to carry out a role of subduing this portion of creation that God is assigning them to. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we have to look at it in that way. And the way that God really intends for man to do that is for man to do it like he would. It's to carry out this role and this function in a way of dependence, in a way like he is. And so we even see kind of similarly the likeness idea in Genesis 5, 1-3 too, where there's this capacity for the son of Adam to be like his father, And so I think that it kind of carries this framework of image likeness being functional, but also having the ability to be like, the one
Yahweh in the area of representation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think that it's not something that, if we took categories like more philosophical categories of, like consciousness or conscience or
emotional being. Yeah.
But then, like, the question, there's all kinds of questions that come up, and this has been talked about, is in, people have debated this, is like, well, what happens to human beings who are maybe less able in their consciousness or conscience, or they have disabilities or whatever? Does that mean that they're less of the image of God than other human beings?
Insight.
And like, is there a gradation of it? Can we, And so I don't think that those kind of categories hold up to either the context or really to it being consistent across the board. And so it seems like the context again is just this function of being given stewardship of the earth, and it's something that's built into human identity. It's not something that we just like take on or something. I think it's built into the very framework, and that same framework will be held accountable in the future on the day of the Lord.
The issue of stewardship is an issue of being given what we would say delegated authority. It's an issue of dependency.
Yeah.
It's an issue of reliance, because now let's move to this last passage, David, and this again, for you podcast listeners, this is going to segue into session 2 that David will be coming back as we move into Genesis 3 next week on Monday evening. But I just want to address this, David, and let's just close up our time in discussing this for a few moments. Genesis 2, verses 15 to 17. And if you guys remember on Monday night, I was talking about how God gave the stewardship, delegated authority for Adam to rule the earth. But it's almost like a God will give you an assignment, but he'll always give you a test. And it's just interesting that God, from Eden, from the garden, he desired Adam to steward the garden in light of future stewardship of the earth as, they began to multiply. But Adam failing in the garden, this begins to create the fall, the problem that we begin to see in Genesis 3. But I just want to read this passage, Genesis 2:15. Then Yahweh Elohim took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it, to steward it, to manage it, to serve and to guard the garden. Then Yahweh Elohim commanded Adam, or the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. And so one of the things David and I were discussing earlier, and we'll begin to just bring things to a close with this, is that God gives man authority. Not only does he give the divine beings delegated authority of the heavens, but human beings delegated authority over the earth. And as David said, yes, there will be the holding of account at the day of the Lord for both divine and human beings. And you can look, just reread like Psalm 82, Psalm 83, and you'll see the divine and the human being judged in those two passages at the end. It's a very interesting passages there. Again, Psalm 82, Psalm 83. But David, we see a direct, right here in the beginning, in the origins, that when God gives a command, when it's transgressed, he comes to deal with those things. And so there's boundaries being set here. God gives rule. He does give authority. He does call us to steward, but to steward rightly and to steward according to his command and according to his word. So let's kind of bring things together. Any thoughts there, David?
Yeah, I think that we'll look at this more obviously next week, but the issues of transgressing the boundaries, is a big thing in these initial chapters, that what God sets for man to walk out in obedience, man actually, he doesn't. He transgresses that thing. He oversteps that and really rebels against that. And then also later we'll see that these other beings do that. And these are all of these, these three instances that we'll look at.
Genesis 3, Genesis 6, Genesis 11.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully we'll get to all of it.
Sure.
But
maybe not this coming week. But...
Yeah, the big topics. But it's like each of these is met with God coming and intervening and bringing about judgment and discipline and limitation to what's going on, because there's this like overstepping beyond the boundaries that he set.
Which is what this word transgress means. When we read transgression throughout the Torah, throughout the Psalms or the prophets, transgression is going beyond the boundary that God set. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think it's related to that. Yeah, okay. Somewhat. But yeah, I think that we can like look at maybe even in future things about like sin and iniquity and transgression, sure. but really just this overstepping of what's going on and what the intentions are is a vital theme that is laid out in these three big sections of these initial chapters over this whole span of almost 2,000 years, which is crazy. So I think that kind of sets the stage for us as we begin to unfold that for next week. So,
well, Dave, it's been real.
Yeah.
Man, very helpful even for me. I just sitting here and dialoguing. I think it's just great. As you are looking at that podcast, you'll also see some additional supplemental resources that we hope will help come alongside of what we're discussing here today. God bless you guys, and it's a joy serving with you.